so much for having me come in to speak to you today. So my name's Bea Natzler, and I work at the Committee on Climate Change. So I'm going to do a sort of 20-minute presentation this morning, and please feel free to jump in at any point. I'm really open to being guided by what's useful and most relevant to the group. So I thought I would talk you through just at a high level, very briefly, what the CCC does, what the UK's commitments to reducing emissions are, and our really high level assessment of how the UK is doing. And then given the sort of focus of this group, I thought I could speak through the kind of implications of this, particularly for buildings and land, and then talk you through a relatively new strand of work that myself and my team are leading on, exploring the role of business in the UK's transition to net zero. And then perhaps a bit cheeky, I've got a couple of questions I'd really like to ask you all and hear your thoughts on. Cool, so what are the UK commitments to reducing emissions and who is the Climate Change Committee? So the Climate Change Committee, the CCC, is an independent statutory body that was established in the Climate Change Act in 2008. So we're tasked with advising the UK and also with devolved governments on their emissions targets. So what this means in practice is every 5 years we develop a carbon budget that's a bit like a sort of stepping stone towards the UK's legislated target of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. And then in the interim, every year, we produce a progress report that gets laid before Parliament that assesses the UK's progress to reducing emissions and generates formal recommendations that the government has to respond to and to address the gaps that we identify. I won't go through this slide in detail, but just to note that, yeah, the UK has a legally binding emissions reduction target that was updated a few years ago based on our advice to be net zero by 2050. And this has quite important implications in the coming years. So as you can see on this graph, if you look at the one on the left, the positive thing is that we can see that UK emissions have been reducing fairly steadily in the last few decades. But to reach the UK's target of net zero, we need to see like a continued decline in emissions. That's that purple line there. But if we continue as business as usual without additional policies and measures brought in, what we expect to see is that thick black line there. So actually a slight increase in emissions in line with increasing GDP and other factors. So what do we need to see to get to net zero emissions by 2050? If you look at that graph on the right-hand side, you can see that in some sectors since 1990, there's been quite a considerable decrease in emissions that's driven that decline on the left. So in particular in the electricity supply. But for other areas such as buildings, lands and transport, there hasn't been such a decline. But in the next 5 years, we really need to see that to keep staying on that purple line to stay on track for our long-term target. So very quickly, how do we think the UK is doing? So this is just some high-level snapshot messages from our last progress report. So this slide shows for each of the key sectors that make up our carbon economy, so to speak, and how their emissions pathways have been doing and how they need to look. So you probably see there's quite a lot of sort of similar stories across the sectors here. So some gradual declines in general, but quite a lot of progress still needed to stay on track. The notable exception being the electricity supply, which has been where there's been good progress decarbonising it. Great. And then just to say, so in our progress report, we for each of the emissions reductions that are needed to stay on that purple line, we do an in-depth assessment of the policies and measures in place to ensure that emissions reduction happens. And then we RAG rate it. So if we think there are credible plans in place to achieve that emissions reduction, we rate it as green, going through to red, where we think there are completely insufficient plans. So there's a kind of mixed story here. You can see there's a fairly sizable chunk that is green, but there's also quite a lot of areas for concern, ranging from sort of yellow to orange to red, and that includes in the kind of immediate years to come. And as we might expect, it grows in future years where we might not expect policies to extend in such a robust way. How does this break down across sectors? So this graph shows in 2035 the emissions reductions that we need to see, and then shows our RAG rating for the policies in place for those emissions reductions and each sector. So you can see it's quite a positive story for surface transport and for electricity supply, but some real areas of concern for buildings, agriculture and land use, and manufacturing and construction, where we see some quite significant policy gaps, most notably needing a land strategy and needing stronger policies on energy efficiency and the rollout of low carbon heat for buildings. So based on this in-depth assessment, every year we generate recommendations. I'm not going to talk through the slides in detail. I can share the slides afterwards, but I just thought, given the interest of the group, I would flag up the buildings and agriculture and land use one. So these are recommendations to government rather than to groups such as yourselves, but can be useful, I guess, to keep in mind in terms of what hopefully we would see coming in the coming years. So within buildings, we recommended that a comprehensive public energy advice service was needed so that households could understand how to reduce their energy usage and actually in the current context, energy bills as well. We recommended energy price reform so that the policy costs that are included on electricity and gas prices are rebalanced so that electricity is no longer distorted to be more expensive than gas. Finalising plans for a market mechanism for low carbon heat. So, for example, the government proposed putting an obligation on manufacturers of gas boilers to also roll out heat pumps. And we recommended filling the policy gap for energy efficiency measures in homes that are lived in by their owners. And for agriculture and land use, we recommended that essentially a strategy across the board is needed because currently there's a real gap there and funding and incentives are needed for increased tree planting. So that's our kind of policy assessment. I'm keen to get on to sort of to focus on, I guess, the practical implications for this group. So I just thought I'd talk through in a little bit more detail what we see as some actions that could be taken by businesses or other organisations to move things forward for buildings and land. So to start with the buildings, so I mentioned before that we sort of model using carbon budgets, the UK's pathway to reaching net zero. So based on our modelling, there's some sort of key milestones and actions that need to happen to stay on track in the building sector. And I think these can broadly be divided into sort of 4 buckets, so it won't cover everything. So the first is energy efficiency. So we need to see in both homes and non-residential buildings a real increase in energy efficiency pretty much across the board. We recognise there's some buildings where it's much more challenging to insulate, but in general, we need to see a real increase in the EPC ratings for buildings by the end of this decade, so by 2030. With commercial buildings, i.e. not homes, kind of leading the way, given often payback periods for energy efficiency for these buildings are shorter. We need to see a boiler phase out, so enablers to be in place so that when boilers reach the end of their life, they're replaced by low carbon heating, which would largely be heat pumps, but we're kind of open to different technologies and a bit of a technological mix. Linked to that, we need to see a ramp up in heat pumps, so growing the supply chains and markets for them starting from now. So there's a high level being installed by the late 2020s. And then finally, a ramp up in low carbon heat networks, particularly in really densely populated areas, so that by 2050, around a fifth of heat that's distributed is being distributed through low carbon heat networks. So what does it mean for organisations? So essentially, up until 2030, the real priorities are maximising energy efficiency wherever possible in buildings that that you own or have control over the energy efficiency of. It means looking to make sure electricity use is renewable wherever that's possible. When it's the appropriate timing, when you're sort of looking to replace or upgrade your heating system, focusing on low carbon heat options such as heat pumps or connecting to a local heat network if that's available. And yeah, these sort of other final 3 bullet points are perhaps less chunky but still important. So I'm thinking about adaptation measures as well when installing energy efficiency measures, thinking about embodied carbon if there's any building projects involving new buildings, and thinking about use of timber in construction as well. So then moving on to land use. So in that CCC model pathway from reaching net zero again, a couple of kind of key components of it. So the first is a shift in diet, so a reduction in sort of average diet across the UK to have a 20% shift away from meat and dairy products by 2030 and a further reduction of 15% by 2050. An increase in afforestation rates quite significantly to 30,000 hectares in 2025. A restoration of peatlands by 60% by 2035 and rewetting lowland crop areas. Yeah, and so it's probably quite explicit what this means for people who are managing or owning lands at a sort of most direct level, but it sort of would involve, where relevant, looking to increase tree plantation, hedgerows, peatland restoration if this is relevant to your area of land, encouraging reduction of meat and dairy in employees' diets, such as through like canteen provision, hospitality, etc. And thinking about carbon labelling, this is probably less relevant to you guys, but for certain businesses on food products that are being produced and sold. Okay, great. I'm rattling through. So the last section of this presentation is really to update you on a new strand of work that we're doing, or relatively new at least, on the role of business in reaching net zero. So historically, because the CCC provides quite technical quantitative advice to government on net zero pathways, the bulk of our analysis and team's resource has focused on sector-specific analysis for decarbonisation. So for example, in the organisation, we have a team that leads on analysing how to decarbonise the built environment, how to decarbonise industry, energy supply, etc. But in the last few years, there's been an increasing recognition that while it's the priority for us is to establish these targets and understand things at a sector level, that a series of sort of cross-cutting enablers or themes that are really key for real-world delivery of progress across sectors, such as governance, public engagement and support, and business. So that's where the business theme comes into play. And so in the last few months, we've had a new team established called the People and Business Team that will be focusing primarily on these cross-cutting enablers. But we have had some work in the last few years sort of building up to this to date. So just to perhaps briefly speak you through that. So I've listed the sort of main publications that we have put out in the last 2 years relating to the role of business. So when we published our 6th carbon budget analysis in 2020, we included a brief that was essentially trying to translate our pathways to make it digestible for a business audience. So those slides I just spoke through, pulling out the kind of key actions, were based on some of the information in that brief, though it goes into a bit more detail. We also, in our annual progress reports, now have a chapter that focuses on assessing progress with a business lens. And I'll speak you through a couple of the key messages from that in a second. And then more immediately, in the last year, we've done a report focused specifically on voluntary carbon offsets, assessing their kind of risks and opportunities they pose to the net zero transition. And then from the adaptation side, we put out a report looking at the need for making supply chains in the UK and internationally more resilient, and assessing the needs for investment into adaptation measures. And then finally, just a note, we've got some pretty exciting work coming up focused on the role of business, which I'll speak you through in a bit more detail in a second as well. So we've started to convene a group of businesses to inform our understanding of the net zero transition. And we're planning to put out a CCC report that really analyses and does a bit of a stock take on the contribution that the private sector has done to date towards net zero emissions reduction, and sets some sort of goalposts and milestones for what they can do going forward. So what did we say in our progress report this year around the role of business? So first of all, we had a go at estimating what proportion of UK emissions are due to business scope 1 emissions. And it shows that around 2/3 of this has got some uncertainty of UK emissions fall within business scope 1 emissions. And you can see that cuts across a lot of different sectors. So business clearly has a really key role in driving the UK transition to net zero. We also looked at the number of sign-ups to Science-Based Target Initiative. And you can see here that while it's really encouraging to see there was a real increase in net zero commitments in the build up to COP26 last autumn, since then there's been quite a significant drop off. And really it was predominantly pretty large FTSE 100 businesses signing up rather than smaller businesses, which is perhaps to be expected, but shows that while the headlines can suggest there's sort of net zero targets everywhere, it's actually quite concentrated in a certain select group. And so we assess government policy as it relates to businesses and financial institutions. And a couple of key messages and recommendations that we put to government are on the slide here. And I won't speak through all of them, but perhaps just to pull out something that we often emphasise to government is the need for clear long-term policy signals to the private sector in our engagements and in conversations such as these. Often what I hear back is that people just really need more clarity and certainty in terms of what regulations are going to come in place when, so that they can plan and decide their investments accordingly. And we also recommended a need for more support for SMEs to provide them with guidance on how to reduce emissions when they have limited capacity. So Suzanne recommended it would be good for me to really focus also on what's coming up next. So I briefly mentioned this, but to dive into it in a bit more detail, we're really keen to understand from people who are actually where the rubber hits the road, what the kind of practical challenges and opportunities are for businesses engaging in net zero. So since the we've convened a group of 11 UK businesses who span across different sectors, they're different sizes, different regions, and I guess, yeah, different stages of their climate journey, to come together and have very frank, open discussions around what they feel business can offer and what they would need to see from government. So this group is convened by the British Chambers of Commerce, by Siobhan Haviland. We've actually got our third meeting of the businesses this week. And in spring, that group will produce its own short output summarising its insights into the opportunities and challenges net zero poses to UK businesses. And then we will draw on that and our own internal analysis, desk reviews, and more structured engagement with a wider set of stakeholders to produce a CCC analytical report on the role of business in the net zero transition. So to give you a bit of a sneak peek of sort of some of the key areas that the group of businesses has focused on and sort of wanted to emphasise, these are kind of the four main messages that currently are coming out. So just the emphasis on businesses taking ownership of their own emissions by measuring them through robust methodologies, disclosing them, setting ambitious targets, and covering all three scopes of emissions. Then there's the real focus on private investment. So our analysis shows that around £50 billion per year will be needed for the net zero transition in the coming decades. And a lot of that will be delivered by the private sector. So we've been going into quite in-depth discussions with them around what is really needed to unlock that investment at scale. And then there's a piece just looking at that yellow box there around sort of wider influence, so thinking around the influence businesses have on policymakers, on customers, on suppliers, including scope 3 emissions, and thinking around the role of procurement, both from a government and large business perspective on that. Great slide. So just to give you a bit more context on the CCC's own analytical report on net zero business that we're planning on. There are a lot of groups out there who think about the role of business in reaching net zero and sort of, assess FTSE 100 targets. We've got obviously CDP, tracking disclosures. So we're keen to make sure that we're adding value in this space. So because of the CCC's position, our focus is really on doing a kind of independent stock take of the contribution that the private sector has made to the net zero transition in relation to our modelled pathways. So this will probably include pulling together some indicators of progress to understand like where things are working and where they're going too slowly. It will also involve possibly translating our modelled pathways that I showed earlier on graphs into pathways that are relevant to the private sector, so possibly translating them into pathways broken down by like retail and manufactured goods and food and drink rather than our sectors which are like transport, industry, etc. And then really highlighting the key actions needed from both business and government to move things forward. And as I mentioned, we'll be having some quite structured stakeholder engagement for that, which we're planning out at the moment. It may involve some roundtables or kind of more sort of open call for evidence or sort of sending round draft documents for review. So we'll be very open to discussing this group's potential to feed into that. Great, so I've got to the end of the presentation, but I just wanted to put up a couple of questions I'd be really curious to hear from the room on, which is really, does this work on the strand of business sound useful to this group? Are there bits that sound more or less useful? And would that translating of emissions pathways into ones relevant to the private sector be sort of adding value from your perspective, or would something a bit less quantitative and more kind of action focused be more useful? And there's a couple of other questions up there that I'll leave up, but yeah, perhaps I'll pause there and see if there's any questions.
Great, thanks, Bea. Really interesting presentation and just very impressive to see the remits that you understandably need to, that holistic view of, from right across sectors and across the whole of the UK. It's really, really fascinating to see that the detailed work that's already happening and is planned as well. It's really fascinating. Thank you. Okay, would anyone like to have a go at answering some of those questions that Bea posed, or potentially ask any other questions? Please feel free to do that now.
Yeah, I should say very open to people asking questions as well. I'm not not only the market for answers to those.
Hi, Bea. I'm from the Landmark Trust. You really went through it very quickly, and there's a ton of information there which I find fascinating. I'm new to this industry, but it's really interesting to see how the UK is doing. And what I would find helpful is A, your slides, and B, understanding the background to UK businesses and where we fit in and how we're doing, so that we can measure our performance against the norm. I don't have set answers to your questions, I'm afraid, but I just want to let you know that, you know, you rattle through that. I'm going to go redo your slides, and I think what I will do is share them with colleagues in the Landmark Trust, because I think it gives a really helpful background as to where we are, where we're going, and what's happening out there with government and analysis. Yeah, I just wanted to say that, really. Thank you.
Thanks, Alice. That's great to hear. And yeah, I'm really glad it sounds useful. I mean, I guess, yeah, it's an interesting point in general, that kind of, I think something we hear quite a lot is that organisations trying to think about their own net zero journey. There's a lot of sort of consultancies out there and guides and the like. But I guess there's a question around if there's enough translation of our kind of big picture pathways into practical actions for specific organisations. So yeah, it would be interesting in slower time when you look through our work to hear what we can do to make it more suggestible, because traditionally we produce it with government policymakers and people who are quite up to speed with all these kind of things in mind, but really now what we're needing is people across the piece to take this up and figure out how they slot into those priorities. So yeah, that's great to hear. I'm very happy for the slides to be shared. There's just one that I'll remove from the advisory group on business emerging messages, but yeah, Suzanne's got them, so sure they can be circulated.
Thanks, Alice. Yeah, I agree. It's hugely helpful for context setting and just to give that bigger picture.